Bob Dylan just did something very few people thought he would do. He called out Neil Young after years of silence. Not a compliment, not a polite comment, but a comment enough to make the entire music world stop. At 83, Dylan doesn't need to make a fuss, but one sentence from him makes a bigger impact than any lengthy interview. Throughout his career, Dylan avoided any public personnel association with his contemporaries. And now, when he breaks that rule just to talk about Neil Young, everything that was once considered unclear between them now begins to be resolved. In early 2025, Bob Dylan appeared at a private meeting with the production team of the film A Complete Unknown. That's what I loved about this period in Dylan's life and in folk history. The event was not widely reported by the media, but just a few days later, social media exploded when a recording was circulated in which Dylan made a few comments about Neil Young. The sentence was not long, but it was more than enough to create waves. Neil always plays his way without anyone's approval. In the music world, such a statement from Dylan is like an envelope that has been sealed for many years finally being opened. For someone who has chosen silence as part of his brand, just a few words are as valuable as a biographical chapter. The comment quickly spread across forums, especially among folk rock fans. Longtime Dylan followers know he rarely mentions anyone by name, unless it's absolutely important. The last time Dylan mentioned Neil Young in a public statement was nearly 2 decades ago, and that was only with a vague compliment about his free spirit. This time he didn't talk about technique. He didn't talk about his career. He went straight to the way Neil lived, a comment on human nature. It was the kind of comment Dylan rarely made, much less about his contemporaries. What makes this moment special is the context. A few weeks earlier, Neil Young had appeared in an interview and told a story that was deeply personal. He said he once kicked Dylan off the bus because he didn't recognize him, then laughed and said, "Bob never introduced himself, just sat there like I should know." The story quickly went viral as a random reminiscence between two people who are notorious for their lack of communication. But just a few days later, Dylan mentioned Young, not to contradict, not to agree, simply to acknowledge Neil's presence. A presence that didn't require consent. The timing has led many to assume that Dylan was following Neil Young's statement. This is not too unlikely. Although Dylan does not use social media, he does have his own team, and such statements certainly cannot escape his notice. But instead of responding in the usual way, Dylan chose his own way. No explanation, no response, just a weighty comment. Soon, sites like Rolling Stone and Variety began to analyze Dylan's statement. Comments on Reddit and Twitter were mixed. Some saw Dylan as acknowledging Neil Young as an artist who plays his own game, a way of asserting his own independent spirit. Others saw it as a subtle nod to his eccentricity, a gentle jab that was Dylan-esque in style. But either way, it was clear that Bob Dylan had stepped out of his silence, not with a criticism, but with an admission. And that resonated. It wasn't the first time Dylan had spoken about other artists, but few names had received the kind of simple, unambiguous recognition he gave Neil Young. And this wasn't part of a promotional campaign, not a big interview, but a Dylan-esque occurrence, surprise, cool, and deliberate. A line dropped when no one expected it, then gone as if he'd never said it. But the audience didn't forget, and neither did the media. What makes this more than a statement is the timing. Both Dylan and Young are in the twilight of their careers. They're no longer performing on stage, but each statement is seen as a statement. For someone like Bob Dylan to choose this moment to speak out is a deliberate choice. He has nothing to defend, but he still chooses to maintain the proper respect for Neil Young. And that's why the public is constantly analyzing. When the quietest person starts speaking, all other noise stops. Bob Dylan debuted in the early 60s, pioneering modern folk music with its social, anti-war, and symbolic undertones. Neil Young arrived a few years later but quickly established a distinct musical identity influenced by folk rock and country. Both went against the grain when necessary, redefining their sound in each period. But that commonality did not bring them closer together. Dylan has always kept his distance from all industry contacts, even those who have worked with him on stage. Neil Young, on the other hand, is straightforward, openly expressing his thoughts and not hesitating to praise or criticize anyone, including big names in the music industry. This creates a clear difference in the way the two interact with the outside world. Dylan is reserved to the point of being unapproachable, while Young is outspoken to the point of being somewhat reckless. This contrast creates a kind of parallelism. They exist side by side, can respect each other, can influence each other, but rarely flow together. Dylan's career has always been symbolic, every move a cultural statement. Young's has been rugged, non-linear, always ready to change direction on impulse or in response to social realities. When Dylan turned to gospel, in the late 70s there was controversy. When Young turned to grunge, there was confusion. But both have remained intensely individual, even stubborn in their music. Over the past 6 decades, the press has occasionally tried to pit them against each other. Articles have asked who truly represents the spirit of the folk rock era. But neither Dylan nor Young has seemed interested in such comparisons. Neither has publicly challenged them, nor has either of them contested their position. Their indifference is how they maintain a balance between two artistic worlds that are close, but not identical. Their relationship doesn't stem from behind the scenes or personal life. There are no shared trips, no decades-long friendships like Dylan and Joan Baez or Young and the members of Crosby, Stills and Nash. Their connection, if any, is only in their onstage moments and brief interactions in interviews. But that's what makes each mention of each other's name so powerful. When Neil Young says that Dylan pioneered a generation, he is not speaking as a friend, but as a distant observer, conscious of both distance and value. When Dylan describes Young as a free-spirited artist, he is not using a rhetorical flourish, but making a pure statement about the nature of the artist, respectful, but not necessarily intimate. Dylan's statement in 2025 only proves it. He knows who Neil Young is. He's noticed how Neil works, and he's chosen the right moment to say it. This relationship doesn't require friendship. It doesn't require conflict. It doesn't require being on the same side. Simply existing and being acknowledged is enough to get noticed. Rare intersections. Rare intersections. Bob Dylan and Neil Young's careers have spanned more than 6 decades, yet the number of times they've actually shared a stage together can be counted on one hand. Each instance is a milestone for fans, not just because it's rare, but because it reveals the unnamed special bond between the two artists, even if only for a moment. Dylan and Young first appeared together in public in 1975 at the Snack Benefit concert in San Francisco, a fundraiser for school sports programs. While there was no formal duet, the event saw them sharing the same performance space along with members of the band. Dylan performed songs like I Want You and Knocking on Heaven's Door, while Young joined in on his famous electric guitar. Though they didn't share a microphone, the fact that they were together at such a community-oriented event gave the impression of a shared sense of values, a rare occurrence for two artists as independent as they were. In 1988, Neil Young hosted the 2nd annual Bridge School Benefit and invited Dylan to perform. It was one of the rare occasions when Dylan agreed to appear at a charity event organized by another artist. He performed folk classics like Wagner's Lad and With God on Our Side before an audience sitting in the California afternoon sun. Young did not sing with Dylan, but the fact that Dylan was invited and accepted was evidence of a mutual respect strong enough to make the unlikely event happen. The truly special moment came in 1994 at the Roskilde Festival in Denmark, one of Europe's biggest music festivals, when Bob Dylan and Neil Young performed the iconic song All Along the Watchtower together on stage for the first time. Though originally written by Dylan, the song had been elevated to legendary status by Jimi Hendrix's cover. Dylan's willingness to share it on stage with Young was more than an artistic gesture. It was a form of recognition. The combination of Young's piercing vocals and Dylan's strange phrasing created a one-off version, never officially released, but still widely remembered by those who witnessed it. After that duet, it wasn't until 2019 that Dylan and Young appeared on the same bill again. 2 special shows were held, one in Kilkenny, Ireland, and the other in Hyde Park, London, attracting tens of thousands of spectators from around the world. In Kilkenny, they performed Will the Circle Be Unbroken, a traditional folk song symbolizing connection across time. That these two legends performed it together was no coincidence. It conveyed a message that you don't need to be close to be able to accompany one another. The Hyde Park performance was dubbed the Dream Double Bill by the media, a legendary duo sharing the stage. Though they played separately for most of the show, the event became one of the most notable moments of their final decade. Dylan and Young's appearance together was seen as a final salute to a musical generation that defined the century. What's remarkable is that in all their performances together, Dylan and Young barely interacted in public. There were no hugs, no public thanks, no warm introductions, as is customary between artists who respect each other. They simply stood next to each other, played, and quietly left the stage. That cold, detached presence didn't diminish the value of the moment. On the contrary, it made every detail more meaningful. For Dylan and Young, a song played together carried more weight than any speech. Their song choices during joint performances also reflected a musical affinity that transcended individual personalities. All Along the Watchtower speaks of vigilance and change. Will the Circle Be Unbroken is about continuity. One writes the song, the other chooses to sing it as a duet. Two different souls can still set aside their personalities for a brief moment of harmony. Though Dylan and Young's performances together are rare, they're not just musical events. They are silent expressions of recognition. No words, no lengthy agreements. Simply stepping on stage together is enough to establish one thing. There is an unnamed bond between them, and that may be more valuable than explicit intimacy. Statements. And mutual influence. When Bob Dylan mentioned Neil Young at age 83, it wasn't the first time Young's name had appeared in his words, but it was the first after a long silence. Though their direct interactions were few, Dylan and Young had always watched each other from afar, through comments, memoirs, and especially through their art. They didn't mirror each other, but sometimes one wrote while the other listened. Young has long made no secret of Dylan's strong influence on him. In a Rolling Stone interview in the early 1970s, Young called Dylan a trailblazer, the first person to bring socially protest-oriented lyrics into popular music in a profound way. At the time, Young was still forming his identity, but he soon realized Dylan was not just an artist but a guide. On several occasions, Young has admitted that his earliest songs were influenced by Dylan's way of putting social issues into words without needing to explain them. In 2012, in his autobiography Waging Heavy Peace, Neil Young continued to speak respectfully of Dylan, describing him as an artist who always moves forward and never looks back. This wasn't a flattering exaggeration, but an honest reflection of an important aspect of Dylan's style: constant change and the willingness to abandon the old before it becomes routine. Young considers that an artistic quality worth emulating, even if he doesn't always follow that path himself. In a 2017 interview with The Guardian, Young offered sharp yet admiring praise. Bob Dylan can sing out of tune and it still sounds right. That short but sufficient statement shows that Young understands Dylan as an artist who transcends conventional standards. What Dylan does may not always be theoretically correct, but it's emotionally right, something very few artists can accomplish. Dylan's comments about Neil Young are rarer, but they are not without weight. In his 2004 memoir Chronicles Volume 1, Dylan refers to Young as a free-spirited musician and praises his inimitable voice. For Dylan, originality matters more than perfection, and he sees that in Young. In a rare 2007 interview with Rolling Stone, Dylan said Neil Young was one of the few people who truly understands the American spirit. That comment was not meant for many people. When Dylan uses the term American spirit, he isn't referring to the flag or politics, but rather to anxiety, broken dreams, resistance, and the desire for change, things Young expresses clearly in his music. Their artistic influence was never a direct two-way street, but critics have noted several points of intersection. Young's 1974 song, Ambulance Blues, for example, is structurally and rhythmically reminiscent of Dylan's narrative style in Desolation Row, long, dark, rich in imagery, and often inaccessible. On the same album, Revolution Blues leans into a slightly political tone, a style Dylan had explored since the early 60s. On the other hand, some critics believe Dylan's 1997 album Time Out of Mind, with its dark blues rock tone, have been influenced by Young's earlier work on Rust Never Sleeps or Tonight's the Night. Although Dylan never confirmed this, the musical atmosphere suggests a quiet, lasting influence. More recently, Dylan's Key West Philosopher Pirate, From Rough and Rowdy Ways 2020, has been associated by some fans with a free-spirited, raw storytelling style reminiscent of Neil Young. While this remains a fan interpretation, it suggests that Young's presence in Dylan's aesthetic space has never fully disappeared. Every time Dylan spoke, Young listened. Every time Young played a hidden melody, Dylan knew. That quiet watching created a kind of influence that didn't need to be public or declared. It just needed to exist. The code for interaction between Bob Dylan and Neil Young didn't include stage shocks or public confrontations, but it still left fans searching for hidden meanings. One topic discussed by music lovers for years is the possibility of a joint album. In the 1980s, some music magazines even mentioned it. With two strong creative personalities, no one knew what the collaboration might look like, but the fact that it didn't happen only made the idea more powerful. Sometimes imagination creates more energy than reality. Another curious story involves comments Dylan made to Young that were cut from a late 90s TV interview. The host later claimed, Dylan gave Young an unorthodox compliment, but editors found it unintelligible and decided not to air it. The original footage has never been made public, but what little remains has sparked debates among fans that have lasted for years. At one point, some claimed Neil Young's song Old Man was written with Bob Dylan in mind. Young later denied it, stating that the inspiration came from a ranch manager he once met. Still, the lyrics evoke an older, more seasoned and lonely artist, keeping the theory alive in some circles of unorthodox analysis. In an increasingly noisy music world, Bob Dylan's simple, concise, and meaningful mention of Neil Young carries unusual weight. There was no grand shared stage, no confrontational statements, but the prolonged silence and distance between the two created a curiosity that never went away. When someone like Dylan speaks, even just a few words, it's enough to stir decades of memories, analysis, and emotion in an entire generation. If you find stories like this worthy of being saved and shared, please like the video, send it to interested friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content, and leave a comment about your feelings after watching.